Professor Sugata Mitra is a man whose dreams and determinations have positively influenced the lives and education of children around the world. Born in Calcutta, India, Mr. Sugata's extensive biography began in 1969 and has not stopped since. From chief and director-level positions to countless honors and awards, most recently being granted the Education Leadership Award from Advanced in 2012, Professor Sugata is an innovator and advocator in the realm of education.
Now, listen carefully. Obtaining his doctorate of philosophy in theoretical solid-state physics of organic semiconductors, did you follow that? Some of you, like ourselves, might be wondering, how did a brilliant man with such a science-based education become such a well-known name in the world of advances in education and learning? Well, Professor Sugata had a dream, an idea to test the synthesis of learning among children from areas in India where the children had low or even no education. His experiment was known as the hole in the wall. It literally was just that, but with a twist. Spread throughout the slums in Kalaji, Delhi, computers were placed in walls where children were able to use them at their own free will, without any direct supervision of educators guiding them through their learning. These children, without such guidance or training, were able to teach themselves things from English to gathering information by navigating through the websites.
As a result of Mitra's groundbreaking research, he was awarded with the TED Prize of $1 million. When asked in an interview, "What are you speaking about at TED?" Sugata replied saying, "A future where knowing is an obsolete idea. Once we get past knowing, we move into an area of learning." He later went on to say, "Knowing is about repeating facts, but learning is the new skill. Imagining, creating, and asking questions is core." Today, Sugata will take us and you behind the scenes of the work which has and will continue to open the doors to innovative, real, authentic learning in the 21st century and those to come. It is our great pleasure to welcome Professor Sugata Mitra.
Good morning. It's quite rare that I find it difficult to begin, because the act that I have to follow isn't very easy. Well, I suppose I could connect it with my talk by saying that what you were watching and why we were so fascinated by it was because we were not looking at someone trying to tell us something. We were looking at someone creating something right there in front of our eyes. And the way in which the human mind reacts when it observes creation, as you will undoubtedly agree, is completely different from when you're looking at facts. So learning, which I guess is our business of everybody over here, like everything else, it had a past, it has its present shape, and it will have a future. This talk is about what could such a possible future be for learning itself. And to look at the future of anything, I guess we do need to look at its past. And since you just saw that great quotation from Greece, a quotation which, parents have said over and over again for the last 3,000 years, the origins of learning also goes back, way back into prehistory, but the first of its recorded evidence comes from Greece, from the Academy of Plato. And Plato writes about his teacher, Socrates. And Socrates has this rather strange method. He gets some students around him, and he asks them a question. And when the students say, well, what's the answer? Then Socrates says, would I ask you a question if I knew the answer? Well, that method of learning didn't last too long. The Greek government executed him for subversion. And we switched over to a much more familiar, much more comfortable origin. This is how schooling has been for the last, well, at least 500 or 600 years. There is a man there. He used to be called, and in some countries he still is called, the master. But that says it all, doesn't it? So who invented this variety of schooling, and why do we have it? Well, I think the origins lie in a rather peculiar circumstance, which is about 300 years or 400 years old. If you look at the 19th century, which is just about 200 years ago, you find a world which is essentially consists of empires and administration. Large parts of the planet constitute empires, and there is an emperor who has to administer the people of that empire. This is an age where there are no computers, and data, which is absolutely essential to administration, is written by hand on pieces of paper. It travels on horseback or on ships, and it reaches from office to office where it is processed by people. In effect, you could think of the administrative system of most empires as a computer. It was a giant computer. It still is a giant computer. A machine. In fact, it's even called a machine. It's called the bureaucratic administrative machine. And it's made up of people. Now, in order to run empires, you need that administrative machine. And you need to constantly supply it with people. The quality of the people that you need to run that machine can be defined very, very precisely. Well, first of all, we know that they must have good handwriting. Secondly, they should be able to read and understand other people's writing. Thirdly, they should be able to do arithmetic in their minds, because there are no calculators. So reading, writing, and arithmetic becomes the pillars of all primary education on this planet. So then, what is the objective of that kind of schooling? Emperors or empires had to create schools in order to provide the parts of the great human computer that will run the administration. They must know reading, writing, and arithmetic, predominantly, amongst a few other things. Most importantly, they must be exactly identical to each other, because the clerks who run the administrative machine must be interchangeable. You should be able to take a clerk out of Istanbul and put him into Ankara, and he should function exactly the same way. The offices should look the same, the desks should look the same, the ledgers should look the same, and the people should look the same. The biggest of these systems came from the biggest of the empires on the planet, the Victorian system. It was invented about 300 years ago. It was cleverly and robustly engineered, so well engineered that it lasts right until today. Look at this room in front of me and look at that picture. It's about the same, isn't it? So they invented this system to produce identical people. Very cute, but very identical. 1878, the Union of Clerks. Okay? Everybody dressed exactly the same way. Everybody knows exactly the same things. Everybody even looks similar. More identical people to run empires. So identical that the clothes that they wear are called uniforms. More identical people to run the industry. Each person should be obedient, healthy, and capable of doing the same task over and over again without thinking too much. Schools have to prepare them to do that. So then, given that rather gloomy background, how relevant is it to education today? Well, firstly, the empires are all gone. The need for all those identical people is also gone or going. So what happens to the products who come out of the schools? I asked myself this question, which I think, for those of you who are parents, I think all of us should ask ourselves this question. Who wants your educated child? Well, imagine that you are the principal of a school, and you're designing a system of education for your school. Obviously, you're going to say, well, who are my customers? Who are the people who are going to use my school? Well, your first customers are the parents, because if you don't satisfy the parents, they won't send their children to your school. What do the parents want? Well, every parent has a certain picture in his or her mind about what they want their child to be like when they come out of school. Well, they should be happy, balanced individuals, presumably capable of producing very good-looking and well-behaved grandchildren for yourself. This is more or less what we want. So the principal has to design to produce such people. Let's say that the parent's perception is a box like that. Now there is another customer. That customer is the government. The government is a very important customer for the school because the government pays for the school. So you have to satisfy what the government wants. What does the government want? Do you think the government wants exactly what the parents want? There is a bit of a difference. There are certain common things, but there is a bit of a difference. The government wants honest and loyal citizens. In other words, people who should not ask too many questions and should vote at the right time for the right people. So the government's picture overlaps the parents, but there is a little bit extra, so the school principal now has to design the school to meet the government's expectations as well. There is a third customer who is not usually taken into account. That is the employer. What does the employer want? Well, we don't care because the employer doesn't pay the school. So when your product comes out of the school and takes up his first job, the usual employer, almost all around the world, will say, where have you come from? What did they teach you in school? How come you can't talk properly? When I ask you what you know, you said that you know the 12 times tables. Well, what do I care? So the employer's requirements are really not taken into account at all. And most employers have to do that training themselves. But there is a fourth customer, a customer that we don't even know about. Often enough, not only do we not think about them, but we don't even know about them. That customer is big. It's the peers. The peers of the child also have a picture of what they want you to be like when you come out of school. What do they want you to be like? Well, we don't know because we never think about them. If I had to put it in one word, I think your peers want you to be cool. Now, I'm in front of hundreds and hundreds of teachers who shudder at the word cool. What is cool? Is school designed to be cool? No, not at all. The reverse. Where should the children become cool? Well, we have malls and supermarkets for them to be cool in. School is not the place where you have to be cool. So you don't take their requirements into account at all. We don't teach them, for example, we don't teach them Twitter. We don't teach them how to write apps. We don't teach them how to handle eBay. All that is left to themselves, all the cool stuff. What do we teach them? Well, definitely 17 times tables. So education is not designed for the only people that your child will be left with. Let's take your child 40 years from now. The parents are gone or going. The government has changed about 20 times, so we don't know what they want anymore. The employers, we can't even imagine who the employers are and what kind of jobs exist at that time. So you can't design for that. Who is the child left with 40 years from now? His peers, for whom no education was designed. So then, what do we do? What do we do in this century of ours without the empires, without the requirement for identical people, and where computers do a whole lot of things which those identical people used to do? What shall we prepare the children for? Well, firstly, I want to make this point, that schools as we know them with their military-industrial background are outdated. We have to recognize that. But things do become outdated, and when something becomes outdated, we generally tend to miss it. Let me think of an example. Oh, yes, you'll remember an object called a fountain pen. You remember? It used to be a nice, good-looking thing with you could change the nib. It could be platinum or gold or something like that. You had to unscrew the top, and then you had a bottle of ink, and you had to pour it inside, then you had to close the top again, and then you put it in your shirt, and whoever had a white shirt usually had a black dot here. So, remember the fountain pen? Well, the fountain pen became outdated and got replaced by a cheap plastic piece of plastic, the ballpoint pen. We all miss the fountain pens, the great firms that used to produce the fountain pens and so on. But then we have this cheap plastic substitute with only one difference. It could go to every one of the 6 billion people on this planet, which the fountain pen couldn't. So you gain some and you lose some when things become obsolete. I'm talking of schools in particular. There's yet another issue that I think we need to discuss. If you look at that picture there, actually in this audience I would be quite surprised if, or rather I would not be very surprised if there were many people who don't know what that object at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen is. Well, let me tell you, because I'm from another generation. I know what that thing is. It's called a radiogram. A radiogram has a gramophone on one side, which plays records, and has a radio on the other side. It's a big piece of furniture like that. The radio takes about 4 minutes to warm up, and then it starts producing a sound. Okay? People were very proud of their radiograms. It used to sit in the living room, and we used to show off our radiograms to our neighbors and so on. Then the tape recorder got invented, and the tape recorder was much smaller. It was about that big, and it was about 20 kilos in weight. So we said, wow, just look at this technological advance. The radiogram has just become portable. You can now take it from the living room to the bedroom. if there are two of you. So the tape recorder then began to shrink in size. And Sony converted it into a little thing that you could put in your pocket, the Sony Walkman. And I still remember my father asking me, when the Walkman first came out, why on earth would anybody want to carry their radiograms in their pocket? But we all did. The Walkman was pretty expensive to start with, but then it became cheaper and cheaper and smaller until it became a tiny little rectangle of plastic, the MP3 player. Now your radiogram was so small and so cheap that you could come back home one day and say, guess what, I lost my radiogram, got to pick up another one. But what happened to the MP3 player is magic. The MP3 player vanished. It just disappeared. It disappeared into a cloud of ones and zeros up there on the internet. Now all you needed was anything that connects to the internet, and you could have all your music, all your entertainment, all your video, everything. The radiogram dematerialized. That sort of thing only used to happen in fairy tales, isn't it? You wave a wand at something and it vanishes. Well, the radiogram vanished. So dematerialization is something that is unique to our century. In a way, we're lucky that we've seen this age of dematerialization. We have seen only the beginnings of it. Well, like the radiogram, other things have also dematerialized. What else? Well, for example, banks. They still have the great big buildings. I saw several of them on Bank Street yesterday. But what do those banks say to their customers? They say, don't come here. Okay, get on the net. Banking has, by and large, dematerialized. Money itself is dematerialized. Money is well on its way to becoming a video game. Okay, we've seen it without really noticing it, that you drive your car through a toll gate, there's a little bip, and that bip means some money just went out of your bank into somebody else's. Dematerialization. What else will dematerialize? Each one of us are in some job or the other. I think this is the right age to think of what will it take for that job to dematerialize. What do you think of that? Don't sound so nervous. Just imagine, let's imagine a situation. Let's imagine that I have a computer which is hidden, like the one I have over here, and I come up here, and the person who is introducing me, instead of giving that long biography which you heard, says that, Sugata Mitra is a famous financial analyst. So I come up here and I have to give a lecture on financial analysis. Now, what you would notice me doing, if I were to do that, is that you would notice that I keep looking down like this, and then I look up and I speak, and then if you ask me a question, my hands disappear over here, and then I take a while, and then I look up and I answer your question, and so on. So, if this was my first day of pretending to be a financial analyst, I would be really slow and really bad. So at the end of the talk, you would go and say, well, what a waste of time. This guy, he's full of idiosyncrasies. Every time before talking, he keeps looking down as though he's meditating. And then he looks up and talks. Every time you ask him a question, he starts fiddling with his hands. And then again, he goes into meditation and before he answers. He's full of idiosyncrasies. Because what am I doing? I'm Googling, of course. But there is a frightening question which follows this one. What happens if I have to give the same financial analyst's lecture tomorrow at another venue with another audience? Do I Google as much as I Googled today? I Google just a little bit less, because I Googled those things yesterday. So the second audience says, well, this guy, Sugata Mitra, the financial analyst, is not too bad. He does have this peculiar habit of looking down every now and then, but other than that, he's quite all right. So I get away with this, let's say, for about 3 years. At the end of 3 years, I'm not Googling anymore. I'm, in fact, addressing the World Congress of Financial Analysts as the famous financial analyst. Okay. So could it be that it is not really pretense? Could it be, and I ask you this question as teachers, could it be that the process of education is of becoming what you pretend? You're all teachers, so presumably you've all been to college where you've been taught how to be a teacher. And then you've been given a certificate which says, you know, Mrs. So-and-so is now certified to be a teacher. So you walk out with that certificate out of the gates of your institution. On that day, are you a teacher or are you pretending to be one? Those of you who have 20 or 30 years of teaching experience will definitely tell me that 20 years down the line, you look back on that day and say, I didn't know anything about teaching. I know now what it means to be a teacher because I became what I pretended on that day. So if that is the process, then Google's not so bad, you know. Well, I bumped into all this rather accidentally, and through a whole series of coincidences, really, in the experiment called, which the press actually called it the hole in the wall. It happened because I used to, well, firstly, why is a physicist, I'm a trained physicist, why is a physicist in this education conference? Well, when I did my PhD, at that time, physicists were the only people who knew how to write computer programs. So when I came out of physics, like a whole lot of my peers, when we came out with our fresh PhDs, we realized that there is a lot more money in writing computer programs than there is in being a physicist. So we started applying for jobs as computer programmers, which were very highly paid jobs. I took one such, and my boss said to me, for heaven's sake, you've got a PhD, what are you doing writing computer programs? Why don't you teach other people how to write computer programs? So I became a teacher. Now, here I was training people how to write computer programs or software development and so on. They were all very rich people's children. And just outside my institute, there were all these street children in New Delhi, slum children. And I used to think, how many programmers are we missing in that crowd of children to whom we cannot provide the same inputs? But what can we provide? Well, I can provide a computer. So I built myself a do-it-yourself ATM in the wall of the slum and gave them a computer, just to see what they would do. And people said, well, this is a pointless exercise because they're going to break it and steal it and sell the parts. But they didn't do any such thing. After about 8 hours, we found that they were browsing and teaching each other how to browse. Okay, they didn't even know it was called a computer. They would say, this machine, one of them, in one of the places, they said, it's got thousands of channels. Okay, they thought websites were channels. Anyhow, so in the first experiment, people said, this can't be true. This can't be happening. So somebody taught them. One of your students must have been passing by and taught them how to use the mouse. I thought, yeah, that's quite possible. So I repeated the experiment. 300 or 400 miles away from Delhi, in a really remote area, in a village, where the chances of a passing software developer would be 0. And then I put the computer in there. There was no place to stay, so I came away. I went back after some time, and again I found children playing games on that computer. So I asked them, so I went up there to see what they were doing, and they said to me, we need a faster processor and a better mouse. So I said, my goodness, how do you know all this? And then they said, this machine works only in English. So we taught ourselves English. in order to use it. Now that was a spine-tingling moment because, taught ourselves English. What does that mean? I repeated the experiment over and over and over again to see whether what I had got in those first two experiments were actually standard results, reproducible results. And I found that yes, indeed, they were. It took about 5 years to verify all of this. Here's a short glimpse of it. This is the first day at the Hole in the Wall. This is January 1999. This little boy on your right is 8 years or 9 years old. His student to his left is 6. In another village, so, in today's terms, it's not very impressive, children playing around with a computer, but you must remember who those children are. The fact that it was 14 years ago when computers were not in every home, and the fact that nobody taught them. I measured this whole thing on a computer literacy scale, and what that graph actually shows is that groups of children, if given access to a computer and the internet, will, in 9 months' time, reach the same level of competence as the average office secretary in the West. It was a humongous result. And it brought up some very serious questions about training, the role of training and the purpose of training. I didn't know what the repercussions of that was. I had just done the measurement, and I said, well, this is what I did, this is what I've measured, and here's the graph. The conclusion at that stage was that groups of children can learn to operate computers and the internet by themselves. You will see in this talk the word groups come up again and again. It's very important, that word. Well, in those days, around 2004 or so, the question I was asked was, so what? So what if children can teach themselves how to use a computer? What are they going to do with a computer in those remote places that they live in? What, if any, would be the effect of that computer on their lives? I had no answer to this question. But I was lucky. About 5 or 6 years later, a filmmaker in India was driving up the western coast of India when she stopped, or she was passing by a village, and in that village, on that village wall, one of the walls, she saw a computer and children around it, and the computer was still working. So she stopped, and she got off the car and approached the children, and the children said, this computer is for children. So she said, well, I'm not doing anything. I just want to find out where did this computer come from? And the children said, many years ago, a man from Delhi came here and he put this computer here and he never came back. So she then camped in that village to find out what had happened. And she got the story of a remarkable school teacher and an even more remarkable student. I have a short extract of that for you.
पे गोवा की बॉर्डर शुरू होती है, वहाँ पे हमारा एक गांव है छोटा सा। एक बाजू में पूरा समंदर है, एक बाजू में पूरा एक सह्याद्री है, और इस दोनों के बीच हमारा गांव है। इस रिमोट प्लेस में कोई भी सुविधा नहीं थी। ऐसे इस टाइम 5 साल पहले हमारे स्कूल में NIT और ICICI इनके दोनों
For those of you at the back, he's just describing the fact that in his village I had put in a computer.
दोनों तो क्या सेंटर का मतलब ही यही था कि बच्चों कंप्यूटर कैसा सीखते हैं, बच्चों की सीखने की पद्धति कौन सी है। 8 से 10-20 तक हमारे स्कूल में के जो आने वाले बच्चे हैं वो हर बच्चे सब बच्चे क्लास सेंटर पर जाते हैं।
So the children would hang around near the computer for hours and hours before
देखने वाले
school.
20 रहते हैं। दो कंप्यूटर एक का एक सेटअप होता है, 3 दिन जाके देखते थे अपने को कुछ करने आता है क्या इसका, वो जायजा लेते थे, वापस फिरते थे। आहिस्ता आहिस्ता बच्चों की भीड़ क्यूआर सेंटर पे बढ़ने लगी और बच्चे को गेम्स ओपन करने लगे।
So he says about 3 or 4 months later they discovered Google.
प्रोग्राम ओपन करते थे, यानी कि पेंट ब्रश ओपन करते थे।
में था तो हमारे स्कूल में कियोस्क लग गया। लग जाने के बाद मैं हर रोज़ वहाँ पे जाता था। पहले तो कुछ पता नहीं था क्या करते, कंप्यूटर कभी देखा नहीं था, हार्डली कभी स्कूल में लेक्चर्स के टाइम कभी सर ने दिखाया था, उतना ही। लेकिन बाद में मैं हमेशा जाने लगा।
So he's saying I had never seen the internet before,
वो हमेशा खुला रहता था,
but now I know what it
कुछ भी कर
is.
सकते थे।
बात होने से बच्चों को तुरंत समझ में आने लगा कि गूगल ये सर
और कियोस्क पे भी बहुत मजा आता था, जब मुझे चाहिए करके। जब
She
हम
says, "I used to
वहाँ पे
like
झगड़ा करते
jostling
थे,
for a
मैं
place
बैठूंगी,
near the
मैं
computer."
बैठूंगी। क्योंकि वो सिर्फ 2 ही थे और हम बहुत सारे बच्चे, तो बहुत मजा आता था।
लोग घड़ा लेके 4 किलोमीटर जाते थे पानी के लिए। आज हमारे गांव में इतना पानी है।
Well, I'll tell you what happened in the rest of the film. This teacher had a problem in that village. They didn't have groundwater. So people had to travel miles and miles to carry water. This man, who is their maths teacher, he looked up his village on Google Earth. He found out where the groundwater comes in, where the higher ends of the hills are, and which direction it seeps in, and where it's likely to accumulate. He calculated how deep he would need to dig in order to get to the water. His calculations showed 14 feet is what he would have to dig. It's a very rainy place. He got the water at 16 feet, and they had water. That child you saw who was talking about the internet, well, he goes on to say on this film, he says, you know, I found a very interesting magazine on the internet. It's called The New Scientist. Now, The New Scientist is a magazine that's read by PhDs in biology and things like that. But he had no way to know. So he said, I've been reading that magazine. It's really interesting. And when I grow up, I would definitely like to work in the area of either biology or biotechnology. So fine, little child's dream. Well, I met him. I met him last year in 2012. I met him in a place that you wouldn't be able to guess. It was Yale, Connecticut. He's on a full scholarship doing a PhD in evolutionary biology. Okay? So when you see this, then when such a small input, just sticking a computer in a wall, produces such a disproportionately large output, in physics, we suspect that what we have encountered is what we call a self-organizing system. You know, if you, let me try and explain that. You must have seen dust devils. You know, on a windy day, if you're in a dusty place, you're sitting there and suddenly you find this little spiral of dirt which rises up and then moves around for a while and then dies down. Well, that's a self-organizing system. If you say, who made the dust devil? No one made it. It just happened. So I began to suspect that what I was seeing in these villages were things emerging like dust devils inside the brains of children. And I decided that I would pursue that to see where it leads. I started experimenting with all kinds of subjects. The idea was to expose children to a subject and not give them any inputs. I'll give you one example, pronunciation. In a city called Hyderabad in southern India, there are lots of little schools which teach English. Their main sort of claim to fame is learn to speak English. And poor people send their children to these schools because it changes the children's job opportunities dramatically if they can speak English. These little schools do a reasonably good job, but they have one insoluble problem. The teachers are all from the local area because, you can't get a really good native language speaker to go and teach in the slums of Hyderabad. So the local teachers have a very strong accent. The local language is Telugu, and they have an extremely strong accent. The children pick up that accent. So by the time they go for a job interview in a city like Delhi or something like that, the interview board says, well, your English appears to be quite good, but I can't understand a word of what you're saying. So it doesn't help. Now, how would one tackle a problem like that? Well, I went to one of these schools and I gave them a computer. This was in 2004, I think. I gave them a computer. In that computer, I bought a piece of software, which is quite commonly available now. It was a speech-to-text software, meaning that if you speak into the computer will type whatever you're saying. So I bought that, I gave it to the children, and I said, well, talk to the computer. So the children spoke into the computer. The computer produced complete nonsense. So the children laughed and said, it doesn't understand anything. So I said, I'll tell you what, I'll leave this computer with you for 2 months. You have to make yourself understood. So the children said, how? And at that point, I invented a new pedagogical method. I said, I don't know. And anyway, this is a lousy city, I'm going away. So I left them with this computer with the speech-to-text on it. And I came back after 2 months. And I still remember the day I went back, there was a little boy called Faizan, who is a story in himself. Anyway, Faizan was standing outside the classroom, and I asked, outside the room where the computer was, and I asked Faizan, I said, Faizan, how are you? And Faizan looked up at me and said, fantastic. So then I went in and I found what they'd been doing. They had discovered and downloaded something called the Speaking Oxford Dictionary. And they were listening to that dictionary word. They would pick up a word, listen to it, speak it into the computer, correct each other's pronunciation. Again, they were working in groups until they got the right word. And they had been doing this for just 2 months, and their accents had changed completely. In fact, one of the girls who was particularly good at this is probably quite well known to you because she works for a call center in India and might have spoken to you about pending bills. So anyway, she's that good. So in subject after subject, I found that the learner was actually capable not only of learning by themselves, but of inventing the pedagogy that would work for them. That was a real new finding for me. So at that stage, I came to this conclusion that groups of children using the internet can achieve educational objectives on their own. Now, until this point in time in my work, school teachers were very good friends of mine. But after this one, there was a slight change. It was also around the time I moved to Newcastle, UK, because Newcastle had got a large research fund for improving the quality of schooling in disadvantaged areas, particularly in India. So they called me, and I went over to Newcastle to do this work. In Newcastle, I gave a similar lecture to a faculty, and at this point, at this slide, the faculty said, aren't you overdoing it? When you say achieve educational objectives on their own, what does that mean? What kind of objectives? To what extent? Are you trying to say that they can do everything by themselves? I didn't have an answer to any of these questions, so I decided I would design an experiment to test the limits of where this might go. How far can it go? I designed an experiment with this research question. Can Tamil-speaking children from a village in India teach themselves the biotechnology of DNA replication in English from a street-side computer on their own? And I thought, what a lovely social science research question this is. I'll give them a test, they'll get a 0. I'll come back after a couple of months, I'll give them another test, they'll get another 0. I'll go back to England and say, we need teachers. I found a village. It was called Kali Kuppam, and it was a little village in southern India. Kali Kuppam already had 2 hole-in-the-wall computers, which I had given them earlier. So the children were quite adept at using the computer. So when I went back to Kali Kuppam, they came running, and I had downloaded some standard material on DNA replication, genetics of the internet, and loaded that into the computer. So they came running and said, what are you doing? So I said, I put in something into this computer which is very interesting, very topical, but I'm afraid it's all in English. So the kids immediately went rushing in. They were 12, 13-year-olds, went rushing in, and then they said, but this has got big English words in it, and it's all chemistry and diagrams. How can we understand this? So I used my new pedagogical method and said, I don't have the foggiest idea, and I'm going away. So I left them for 2 months, and I came back after 2 months. The children, 23 of them, they marched into a classroom. I had called a meeting, and they were looking very gloomy and very quiet. And they said, we've understood nothing. So I said, well. So I said, so how many times did you look before you decided you've understood nothing? So they said, what do you mean? We look at it every single day. So I said, you don't understand a word of what you're looking at, and you look at that every day for 2 months. What for? So then one 12-year-old girl raises her hand and says to me in Tamil and English, and I will remember this for the rest of my life, she says, apart from the fact that improper replication of the DNA molecule causes genetic disease, we've understood nothing else. Thank you. Well, I know what you're feeling. I felt exactly that. I was just, just standing there wondering, what am I going to do with this? So I post-tested them. They had got a 0 in the pre-test, of course, because they didn't know anything about the subject. In the post-test, I got an educational impossibility. 0 to 30% in 2 months on their own. Remember the context. A subject that is 10 years ahead of their time in a language that they don't know, using computers in that tropical heat under a tree in the middle of the road in 2 months. So what was going on here? And I had a very sneaky suspicion. Normally one would have said, what a wonderful achievement, in spite of the fact that you, that is me, that you were not around to help them. That's what we'd say, in spite of the fact that you were not around to help them. When I saw these results, another thought came into my mind. This had happened because I had left. Now that wasn't a very nice feeling. Okay, but I have seen it over and over again, and I'll show you more examples. But anyhow, the point is that 30% in the Victorian schooling system that all of us are a part of is a fail. So they had failed. How do I make them pass? I have to get them 20 more marks. Where am I going to get a biotechnology teacher in Kali Kuppam? What I found was a local girl who works for an NGO. She was 22 at that time, and she was a good friend of the children. So I called this girl and I said, listen, can you help teach them a little more biotechnology? So she said, absolutely not. She said, I didn't have any science in school. I don't know what they do all day long under that tree with that computer and diagrams and so on and so forth. I can't help you. So I said, no, I'll tell you what, use the method of the grandmother. So she said, what's that? So I said, stand behind them, and whenever they do anything, just say, wow, what did you do? How did you do that? Where did you find that page from? Can you do a little bit more? When I was your age, I couldn't have done anything like that. So you know what grannies do. They use, unlike the parents, the grandparents use admiration as their pedagogical method. The parents use discipline. She did that for 2 more months. the results jumped to 50%. The children of Kalikuppam had caught up with my control school, which was a rich private school in New Delhi with a trained biotechnology teacher. When I saw that graph, I knew that there was a way to level the playing field. There had to be. So I went back to England looking for grandmothers. I sent out appeals on newspapers saying, if you are a British grandmother, if you have broadband and a web camera, would you give me 1 hour of your time per week for free? And in 2 weeks, I got 200. I know more British grandmothers than anyone you know. So by now, there are about 600 of them. Not all grannies. There are also young women there. There are men and so on. But I wanted to call them electronic mediators or e-mediators. But unfortunately, my students decided that a better name would be the Granny Cloud. So the Granny Cloud sits on the internet. If there is a school in trouble anywhere in the world, we beam a gran over Skype. Okay? And she goes in there and she sorts out things. You can watch this little clip here.
That's right, as fast as you can. As fast as you can. You can't catch me. You say it. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man. Well done, very good. So again.
So I could finally send a really good teacher to wherever I wanted. And this has been going on now for 4 years. And I've been measuring the two things, pronunciation, and which you can measure quantitatively, and enculturation, which you cannot measure quantitatively, but you can measure qualitatively. And there are significant differences in both. And I think there is enough published evidence to show that children who are read to by their grandmothers tend to become better readers and generally better at languages than otherwise. So it is possible to do this across distance and to wherever you want. So I then put the two concepts, hole in the wall and the Granny Cloud, together into what we call a self-organized learning environment. So how do you bring the hole in the wall into a classroom? Well, it's quite simple. If you have a classroom full of, let's say, 20 children, and let's say you have an affluent school, so you have 20 computers, well, all you have to do is to shut down 15 computers. So you're left with 5. When you're left with 5 computers scattered in a classroom and 20 children, they will automatically start making clusters around each. And then you ask them a question. And then you leave. The BBC made a film on it, and I've got a little extract to show you how that works.
And Sugata's new teaching methods have now also arrived on these shores. The lessons learned are now being applied to schools in Gateshead.
Stephen?
Bonjour.
Bonjour,
The
good.
process is that you take a group of children, you ask them to make groups of 4. Each group of 4 is allowed to use one computer with an internet connection. And then you trigger off the system with a question. That question is absolutely critical.
What I want you to find out for me today is, where does language come from? I don't know the answer.
Where are you going to start looking?
Some scientists have got a theory that language is the very thing that makes us human. Well, no, where does language come from?
What website's this? Wiki Answers? Would it not be easier if the teacher just told you where language came from?
No, because then we wouldn't really be learning anything for ourselves. When you get get a hard question, and if like you find it out, it makes you feel much older.
Do you? That's what you feel about 9.5?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Scott, that's a lot of stuff. I wouldn't have been able to get this much in such a short time. Really?
Experts who study language know that there is no simple answer that explains what words came from.
So basically what she had done was that she'd made an English lesson into a question. The question was, where does language come from? And how come, so we did a little build up on it. We said, how come animals don't talk to each other, or if they do, we don't understand them? Why do we make these sounds that have some meaning and become words, and where did it all come from? So that was the question. They research it in groups. There are some guidelines about how to make a group, which is all available on the web. And then they come up and present their answers. The hidden agenda is that obviously that presentation is in English. So they have to be able to read, they have to be able to understand, they have to be able to discuss, and they have to be able to present. The question should be such that it does drive them. So like these kids, when this reporter goes and asks one of them, wouldn't it have been easier if your teacher just told you where language came from? And he says, well, in that case, we wouldn't have found out anything for ourselves. And then he goes to another girl and says, so what's so great about this way of learning? And this girl says, if it's a really hard question, it makes me feel older. So he says, like how old? She's 8. So he says, like how old? And she says, 9.5. So when I started doing this work in Gateshead, England, and it started spreading in northeast England, which is a fairly, a sort of economically depressed part of the country, teachers started talking to each other and saying, this is fantastic. All that you need to do is to create the right kind of question, and then the rest of it takes care of itself. I started getting calls from all over England, all over Scotland to come and do demonstrations. I did that. Then it started spreading further. I got calls from Europe, then from South America, then from China, then from Australia, and then finally from the United States. And everywhere, the way it works is that you have to do a demonstration first, because otherwise people just don't believe that it can happen. Once you do a demo, then usually a teacher, 1 or 2 teachers in the school will pick it up. And they apply it to their curricular material by converting the curriculum into questions. So what's my stance right now? Well, it's this. I mean, I've been a teacher all my life, so it doesn't make me feel very happy writing that. But groups of children can learn anything by themselves, provided 3 things. Provided they can read, they can understand what they're reading, and they can put together what they're reading into a belief, into what they will believe in. So the speculation that I have right now is that learning in this kind of a setup where you convert education into a chaotic process, learning might be the emergent phenomenon, the dust devil that comes out of nowhere. The new primary curriculum becomes kind of obvious. It's just 3 things. Reading comprehension tops the list, your subject. So we have key stages in England with which we measure reading comprehension. Key stage 1 is where you just about read words, and key stage 4 is where you can read a web page. There is an assumption that it will take about 6 years or 5 years from age 5 to age 10 or 11 to go from key stage 1 to key stage 4. We can't afford it. So I have a challenge for language teachers. How can we take children from key stage 1 to key stage 4 in 1 year? It can be done, I believe. I'm working on it myself. You could try also. The trick, as usual, will be in making reading a self-organized phenomenon, and in allowing reading to happen not individually, but in groups. I suspect, I don't have data to support this. I will in another couple of years' time. They must learn how to search for and find information. Well, that we don't need to teach children. They learn it by themselves very, very quickly. 3-year-olds can start doing that on iPads. And finally, given this barrage of information, given the fact that they can read and understand, they must be armed with a rational system of belief so that they don't just read a page and reproduce it. It takes a little while for them to get the hang of that, but if you allow them to work in groups, it too happens by itself. So I have a few questions for teachers now. How do you examine a connected learner? What happens if you allow the internet into the examination hall? So would you then change your questions or your questioning style? So instead of saying, write an essay on my trip to the zoo, you would then change that to use the internet to find a really nice essay on my trip to the zoo and then discuss why you think it's really nice. So you would need to change that. That kind of changes have to be done very quickly because children don't understand why you take away their mobile phones and their iPads before you examine them. It's like a soldier, if you were to take away his gun and say, now fight, would say, what for? I mean, why are you doing this to me? What does qualification mean in an age where Sugata Mitra can become a financial analyst in no time at all? What is curriculum anyway? Who decides? Isn't it time that we change the method of curricular development? The current method is that 80-year-olds will decide what 80-year-olds will learn. That doesn't make sense, I think. My favorite question, is arithmetic obsolete? You know, I have a 6-year-old grandnephew whom my wife once asked him, so do you know how to multiply numbers? So he said, yeah, of course. So she said, how do you multiply 2-digit numbers? And he said, with my phone. Is the absence of a teacher a pedagogical tool? Well, just for the sake of teachers, I've put a question mark there. Will institutions dematerialize? Will one day halls like this be empty with people coming in on walking tours with a tour guide and whispering to each other, so that's how they used to educate? And what will the future teachers do? A lot of people interpret all this by thinking that I'm saying we shouldn't have teachers. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that we must convert the curriculum into questions. So instead of saying I'm going to teach you the trigonometry of the tangent of an angle, you have to change it to say, how does an iPad know where it is? The answer to that question will lead to the tangent of an angle somewhere down the line, and then you just leave it to self-organize. The trick is in being able to create that question. Just a quick example, one school teacher friend of mine in England, she calls me up one day and says, you know, I've got a problem. I have to teach alternative therapy, you know, alternative medicine to 14-year-olds or something like that. And she says, Sugata, I believe in everything you say, but I cannot believe that there can be an interesting question about alternative therapy. So what shall I ask? Shall I ask, you know, so what's so great about homeopathy? So I said, no, that's a rubbish question. That's never going to work. They're going to, you know, get totally turned off by it. So I made up a question for her. The question was, is it possible to kill a goat by staring at it? Well, the first reaction of the 12-year-olds was, Mrs. Dickinson's gone mad. But then they got to working, and they quickly came up with the fact that paranormal has always fascinated human beings, and there is one set of human beings who believe that there are other ways which are not out of science to do things, etc., etc. It opened the door to alternative therapy. A pedagogy which is based on self-organization, well, that's what I've been talking about all this while. An assessment based on peer evaluation, which we never ever use. But you can try this for yourself. In your class, just ask the class to write down who you think is the best in English. And they will tell you, invariably correctly, who that person is. So why do you want to waste their time examining? Assessment based on peer evaluation. Certification based on employers' recommendations, whoever that current employer is. So if you go to the current batch of, you know, employers, the first-time setups, the internet startups and so on, and ask them what do you want, you'll get a list which is very different from either the government's or the parents' list. we have to integrate that into schooling. And if we can do that quickly enough, might give us the first glimpses of the future of learning. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to say now that in Faizan's words would be fantastic. Thank you so much. We'd like to ask Burju to come up to give your appreciation. Thank you.